After experiencing GPS jamming over Bulgaria, did the pilots flying the plane with the president of the European Commission really circle for an hour before having to land using paper maps? Well, no, of course they didn't. This story is a very good example of how inaccurate reporting using real information about an actual event can lead to misconceptions and completely wrong conclusions. I am making this video because cases like these can drive attention away from real problems and also severely reinforce misunderstandings around how we pilots make decisions, how prepared we are, and based on that, how dangerous these things really are. So what happened then? Well, the aircraft involved was a Dassault Falcon 900 LX with registration Oscar Oscar Golf Papa Echo. Basically a large 3-engine business jet, and this one was operated by a company called Lux Aviation Belgium, who manages and operates a fleet of private jets and helicopters. This particular flight, Alpha Alpha Bravo 53 Golf, took place on the 31st of August this year, and it departed from Warsaw Chopin Airport in Poland at time 14:37, heading towards the Bulgarian city of Plovdiv, which is the second largest city in Bulgaria. On board the aircraft was, like I mentioned, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, along with a team of staff and journalists. And this flight was actually part of a multi-leg trip, visiting several EU countries, all of which were situated towards the east of the European Union and close to Russia or Ukraine. The primary focus of von der Leyen's trip was to discuss efforts to improve the defense of the European Union in view of the evolving war between Russia and Ukraine. The trip had started in Brussels, Belgium, and the Commission President had already flown to Riga in Latvia, then on to Helsinki in Finland, before then reaching Warsaw in Poland. After that came the flight from Warsaw to Plovdiv, which we're going to look a little bit more closely at today. And after Bulgaria, von der Leyen was scheduled to also visit Vilnius in Lithuania and Constanta in Romania before finally heading back to Brussels. Now, Bulgaria was part of this trip because the country has been a key supplier for Ukraine throughout the war, and in Plovdiv, the Commission President was scheduled to meet several officials as well as visiting an ammunition factory. So all in all, this was a hectic and fast-paced day for everyone involved, perhaps with a somewhat charged atmosphere, which could have affected people's perception if things seemed to go wrong, which they also did somewhat. Now, I should make it clear here that this event happened just days ago when I record this, so there is no investigation report on it. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think that there ever will be one either. Anyway, from what information that we do have, it seems like this flight started completely uneventfully, departing from Warsaw at time 12:37 UTC or 14:37 local time. The aircraft took off using runway 29, and after that it eventually turned out to a southerly heading, climbing quickly to reach its final cruise altitude of flight level 390 or 39,000 feet. As they then crossed from Poland to Slovakia, they climbed a bit further to flight level 410 before crossing Hungary and Romania and then finally starting the descent in towards Bulgaria and Plovdiv. Since we have no report, we can't know exactly when the cruise problems started, but based on what we can see from flight tracking sites like Flight Radar 24, it appears like the crew were initially heading for a straight-in landing on Plovdiv's runway 30. Now, the original source for what happened next appears to be an article in the Financial Times, which was published on the 1st of September. In there, we are told that the crew were planning to land using a GPS-based approach, but that they couldn't do it because of GPS interference. The article then goes on to say that the pilots circled the airport for an hour before the pilots decided to land the aircraft manually using analog maps. And later on, the article also describes these as paper maps. That story was then picked up and redistributed globally by dozens of national and international news media and of course hundreds of digital news platforms around the world. They all used different black headlines describing this attack and near emergency, focusing heavily on those paper maps that were described. Now, I'll get back to that nonsense soon. But before I do, let's talk a little bit about the foundation of the problems here, the GPS interference. I have made several videos about the dangers of GPS interference, so I'm only going to describe it in simple terms here. But in short, GPS, the Global Positioning System, is a type of Global Navigation Satellite System, or GNSS. There are several other similar systems around, like Europe's Galileo, Russia's GLONASS, China's Beidou, and others as well. But GPS came first, and it also tends to be the system of choice for certified satellite navigation system on board Western aircraft. Very simplistically speaking, GPS relies on a network of satellites, all whom moves in known orbits around the Earth. And each satellite carries an extremely precise atomic clock, constantly transmitting their position along with an exact time code. That information is then picked up by GPS receivers on aircraft, cars, and in your smartphone, who use the time code information to measure the time the signal took to travel from each satellite down to the receiver. That information then allows these devices to measure their distance to each satellite, and if they are in contact with 3 or more, this can then be used to plot a very exact position. Now, we tend to forget this today, but GPS started out as a military system, which was meant not just as a navigational tool, but also as a way to guide weapons towards their targets. And that is why GPS interference near war zones or military installations is still quite common. In fact, with the war in Ukraine, conflicts in the Middle East, and tensions between India and Pakistan, etc., interference to GPS and other GNSS systems is so common that websites like Flightradar24 actually publish maps that show this interference and the way that it evolves every day. So, how does someone tamper with these GPS signals then? Well, in general, GPS interference takes 2 forms: jamming and spoofing. Jamming is the simplest of the two, and it's basically a form of denial of service. You see, those GPS satellites are moving in very high orbits, which means that by the time their signal reaches us on the ground, it's really quite weak. That also means that another signal transmitting on the same frequency close by can easily overpower or jam the original satellite signal, which then basically stops us from being able to use the GPS system. That's bad, but its evil twin, spoofing, is actually worse. In that case, there is also a powerful secondary transmitter involved, but that one isn't just trying to cancel out the satellites. Instead, it pretends to be one. This fake signal is then adjusted with slightly different timing information to make the receiver think that it is at a completely different position than it actually is. Again, I am oversimplifying things here a little bit because there could be multiple coordinated fake signals involved, but the point here is that unlike jamming, which is immediately apparent when our GPSs stop working, spoofing allows our GPS systems to keep working with wrong information, potentially for several minutes before we realize that something is wrong. And that really matters, because in normal conditions, our aircraft systems are designed to use GPS signals to also update several other, both navigational systems and warning systems on board, creating even more serious problems later on. There is much more to say about this issue, and actually, this is something that Ben and I have recently discussed in great detail in a podcast episode over on the Captain Speaking channel, which I hope that you have already subscribed to. It is just me and Ben talking about aviation and things that we love in the most down-to-earth and natural way possible. I really think you will like it. Now, we don't actually know what kind of interference the pilots in this story was dealing with, but if we look at the GPS jamming map that I told you about before, we can see that on August 31st, the day of this flight, the area around Plovdiv Airport in Bulgaria was indeed subject to that type of interference. So I want to be absolutely clear here. My team and I are not disputing the article's claim that the flight was subjected to GPS interference. That much is pretty clear, and Bulgarian authorities did specifically confirm that such interference was at play near the airport. But it was most likely general and not necessarily aimed at this flight specifically. Having said that, there is information in the reporting that is just plain wrong and definitely misunderstood. Specifically, the use of paper maps and the fact that the aircraft was circling for an hour over its destination before landing, which does sound quite dramatic when you hear it. But was it? Well, let's start with that 1 hour circling claim, since that is pretty easy to look into. If we go to flight radar 24, we can see that the flight was originally scheduled to take off from Warsaw at 13:30 local time, and it was then expected to land at Plovdiv at 16:18. There is 1 hour time difference between those two cities, which means that the flight was scheduled to last for 1 hour and 48 minutes. So if we compare the actual departure and arrival times, we can see that the flight actually lasted for 1 hour and 57 minutes. That's just 9 minutes longer than expected. So where does this claim of 1 hour of holding time come from? Well, I can only speculate here, but note that the plane departed 1 hour and 7 minutes later than originally planned. And obviously, it also therefore landed with a similar delay, which may have had something to do with this. I don't normally like to speculate, but I can do so in this case because the flight crew obviously managed to land safely, and Ursula von der Leyen was then able to visit the factory as planned. Afterwards, her aircraft also departed again with no further problems and managed to visit Lithuania and Romania as scheduled before returning to Brussels. So knowing that, it is clear that the reporting about the flight holding over Plovdiv for 1 hour is just simply wrong. And some of the websites that initially copied this information later did correct themselves, but many also didn't. In any case, that delay in itself would not have even made the news if it wasn't for the fact that it was combined with the news of the pilots having to use paper maps to get down. So let's have a look at that claim then, shall we? Now, I don't know if LOX Aviation pilots still use paper charts. They might do, but in my airline we don't anymore, since those things are nothing but a pain. You see, they get updated constantly, often for very minor details, and keeping a bank of paper charts up to date for hundreds of different airports, with each airport having charts for multiple types of approaches, gets old really fast. So it is much better to access that type of chart through our electronic flight bags, or EFBs, which are basically company-supplied iPads where these charts are kept up to date electronically. But whether or not these pilots had to use IFR charts in paper form or in tablet isn't really the main issue here, because you probably noticed that I said charts, not maps. That seems to be a pretty big misunderstanding for people outside of aviation, who assumes that our charts are basically the aviation equivalent of the paper maps that we once used for driving. I mean, we replaced those maps with GPS, so pilots replaced their maps with the GPS as well, right? No. Our instrument charts are not primarily made to depict geographical features that we have to find by looking out through our windows. Instead, they are basically instructions on how to execute different types of instrument procedures. Now, there are what's called VFR charts that are exactly what you're thinking about, but that's for visual flights, and we never really use those for commercial operations. We don't even have them available. Now, instead, in this case, this crew would have been looking through their normal approach chart for available approaches into runway 30 in Plovdiv, something that we pilots do on every single flight. Before their problems with the GPS interference, they had most likely planned to make an RNP approach for runway 30. RNP stands for Required Navigational Performance, and it is a type of GPS-guided approach which was available for that particular runway. Now, the way that we know this is because there is ATC audio of the pilots informing air traffic control that they seem to have some issue with their GPS, that they can't fly the RMP approach because of that, and would like to be given radar vectors for an ILS approach instead. Now, the controller then responded that they were unable to give vectors, since they are procedural controllers, which means that they don't have access to a radar station at that airport. Instead, the controller just suggested that the crew should follow one of the published ILS approach procedures for runway 30, of which there were 2 to choose from. Now, when we say published procedures, we mean that these procedures have charts describing them. That is what the crew would have been looking for when their GPS gave them problems. And like I said, it's possible that they were printed on paper, but it doesn't really matter. Now, the crew didn't like the first ILS approach that they looked at, because that still included some GPS waypoints. So instead, they requested to proceed from their position towards a VOR called Papa Delta Victor, and then to start a different type of ILS approach from that point. VOR stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range, and it is a type of physical navigation beacon on the ground which is in no way affected by GPS jamming or spoofing. Looking at the flight on Flight Radar 24, we can actually see them overflying the physical VOR, then turning outbound away from the airport before finally making a turn at a specific distance to intercept the ILS. And that is exactly what we would expect to see from an aircraft following the ILS Whiskey full procedure approach for runway 30 at Plovdiv, as described in the chart. So remember when I said that this crew took an extra 9 minutes to land? Well, that's because that's how long it took for them to select this new approach, brief it, and then position their aircraft accordingly. But beyond that, they basically made a completely uneventful approach towards the airport that they always meant to go to, and I doubt that their pulses even increased a little bit. Now, it is a little bit odd that they asked for radar vectors at an airport with no radar. They should have known that, but that's really nitpicking here. So in any case, it is pretty clear that this story got the exposure that it got because it involved a famous European politician and a potential Russian GPS interference. It is also entirely possible that someone on the flight looked forward into the cockpit and saw the pilots double-checking some paper charts. But this doesn't in any way, shape or form mean that they were using this as some type of last resort in order to find their way down towards the airport. This is just completely standard practice. Here, it's also worth pointing out that none of this would have come as a big surprise to this flight crew. You know those GPS interference maps that I talked about before? Well, flight crews are well informed about in which areas we are likely to encounter GPS jamming or spoofing, and we follow specific procedures to make sure that those type of events doesn't disrupt our aircraft systems, as far as it's possible. So, before this crew even left Brussels for their first flight, they knew that they would be spending several hours flying near the eastern borders of the European Union. They also knew that it was a pretty high risk that they would encounter some type of jamming. Now, the reason that they chose to fly an RMP approach anyway was probably because it was shorter. And even though jamming might occur in that area, it's not always active. So if the GPS system would have been working fine, it would have been perfectly good to use. Now, finally, I should also mention that VORs and other ground-based navaids, like the ones that they were using here, is currently being phased out in many parts of the world. With the advent of GPS, we typically use GPS-defined waypoints when we're up in cruise, and RNAV, RMP and other GPS-based approaches are becoming more and more common as cheap and effective alternates to expensive and labor-intensive ground-based navaids. But conflicts like the war in Ukraine and the proliferation of GPS jamming all around Russia and the Middle East are now possibly causing the aviation industry to rethink those phase-out plans. So it is very possible that those VORs and other similar navaids might remain in use for much longer as valuable backups. So if you are an IFR student out there training to become a pilot, keep working on those NDB approaches and holdings. The important thing here is that there are backups, many layers of backups in fact, and we pilots are fully capable of dealing with GPS interference whenever it might occur. So personally, I really hope that journalists out there can start reporting on stories like this just a little bit more carefully. Because reporting like this, especially when it's picked up by small and big news outlets worldwide, risks making the public think that pilots are helpless in dealing with these type of events, when in reality this is really often a nothing burger, as this crew clearly showed. Now, when I first saw this story, I initially just sighed and thought, this is so stupid. But when I then realized that more and more news outlets started picking it up, all focusing on the poor circling aircraft with its pilots trying to find their way through the clouds using ancient paper maps, I thought, I need to say something here. So I called up my scriptwriter Spiros with instructions on what angle that we needed to take on this story, and I then called up Umar, making sure that we could find setup of editors and simulator pilots that could make this episode for me. The team then scrambled and Spiros worked almost through the night in order to have this script ready for me today. I am now recording it, and then Luke, my editor, will be working through the weekend to edit the final product, and then present it to you in the way that you are now seeing it. I'm telling you this to give you just a glimpse into how my team works and just how many people are involved in creating breaking news content like this. I have no sponsor for this episode, but I do have my Patreons who, through their support, still make it possible for me to create this kind of reactive content whilst still paying everyone involved. Informing the public about misconceptions and explaining complicated incidents is exactly what we want to continue to do. And if you want to take part in that work, get to preview my videos and attend Hangouts directly with me, well then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. Thank you so much to all existing patrons out there. My entire team and I are so grateful for your support. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.